Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the unit comparisons analysis for our brand new beast units of February. If you are completely new to this series, I wanted to go over briefly what it is and what you're going to take away from it as a viewer on the video. So what I do here is I go through the units themselves and compare them to units in the 3 and 4 star pool, generally speaking, and budget builds, of course, things that should be accessible to most players. And you can pretty much assume that the builds I use on the units that they will be compared to can also be applied to the unit in question. So like Keaton, for instance, the unit that I do compare him with, you can use a similar build on Keaton and he'll have a functional role. And that's the idea here. We talk about the units themselves and what sort of role they play, and most similar to what they have in the 3 and 4 star pool, so you don't feel like inclined to pull for these units. Especially consider that a lot of units in the 3 and 4 star pool can be easily merged. You may have desirable IVs, and generally their power level will exceed these types of units in the long run should you ever feel like you need a particular unit type. So, and of course I will go over the unit itself and how I feel their stat spread might impact my decision here or there. So, with all that being said, remember that it will be competitive based. So like AR, top level AR, tier 21 and above, for instance, what I see, what I play against, how you can properly use these units and their comparisons for that. You can also, of course, have endless combinations with support, buffs, PvE modes, arena. Those dynamics won't necessarily be covered because any unit can be viable to clear any content. The idea is, in their best situation, how do these units get used? Okay, so first up is Keaton to the left here, as you can see. So Keaton's stat spread is actually more impressive than I gave it credit for. He is still, unfortunately, an infantry red physical type of unit, so he does compare to a lot of sword units, which I'm sure most of you have already invested in. Thing going for him though is definitely that he can use stuff like Heavy Blade combined with his special spiral and his brave weapon. As with all beasts, and this is not just applicable to Keaton, they are a little bit awkward to use if you do not have other beasts with them. They have to be isolated, they're harder to buff, and as a result they're a little bit harder to use. So Keaton has some disadvantages along with all the other beasts in this regard, but generally speaking his attack stat is amazing. He does have an attack super boon, so he's going to be one of the hardest hitting units in the game without a doubt, and therefore he's a bit impressive because of that. However, there is already someone who kind of fulfills a similar role. He's not an infantry, so there are definitely some differences there. But generally speaking, comparable damage comes from Aries in the 3 and 4 star pool. I'm going to show them with a single merge just to show off like what you kind of want to aim for in IV. Aries actually got buffed up, consistently has been buffed up by recent seals, and now defense smoke is also on Panne, so this is kind of like what you ideally want to use on him. Distant counter is like the best idea with Aries, but if you want him to strictly just counter melee stuff, that is the idea here. And yeah, Aries, similar kind of stat spread, a little bit less attack, but you know, his nukes are going to be really hard hitting because he has that slaying effect, unlike Keaton, who can't really use something like bonfire as well consistently, like it's not a 2 charge. Therefore the nukes coming from bonfire are going to be harder hitting than moonbow or glimmer from Keaton. Keaton makes up for it because of his attack, but like I said, when you consider the merges that you can add to Aries, and it's harder to do it with Keaton unless he gets demoted, we don't know yet. Those sort of things make this a very comparable thing. Both of them do have strengths and weaknesses. Keaton's a little bit harder to use because of beasts, and Aries is a cavalry unit, so he's affected by forests and trenches, for instance. But generally speaking, the role is similar in that regard. Moving on, Keaton himself, if I did envision him being used one of the most optimal ways that doesn't involve vantage, distant counter sort of shenanigans, if you had distant counter in the prime form, this is somewhat of a good way to use him compared to like Aries. So brave, the thing is, because he's infantry, he can benefit from things like infantry pulse, and that's huge. So Aries requiring that requires a Velouria now or an osteopulse, which is harder to set up. And Keaton can use like Racing as a dancer for 3 movement. And of course, Gale Force can be 4 charge because of an infantry pulse hitting him, which is much easier to set up than something like Ostia or Velouria being ally support to him. Therefore, you go in, you Gale Force easily with a Brave effect. His attack stat is big enough to consistently proc Heavy Blade, and you have yourself a good distant counter vantage unit that is easier to set up than somebody like Aries. So I give him credit for at least being unique in that role, and this is how I envision would be ideally the best way to use him, especially combined with like Legendary Azor giving him 3 movement. That's kind of huge here. Using stuff like the lightning traps gives you easy setups into vantage range, so bolt towers and whatnot. That's kind of the ideal way to do it. You could also like try to just enemy phase a unit and get low, or yeah, that's how I would definitely do it. Moving on. We do have our next unit to be compared to, which will be Velouria. So Velouria is, as I mentioned in my unit and skill impressions yesterday's video, I'm actually very impressed with her because she is completely unique in the game. Like she is, there's nothing to really compare her to. And as a result of that, I'm only going to really talk about unit builds you should consider using for Velouria. I'm deeply hoping that she gets demoted because there would be a lot of good implications to the game. She is capable of reaching that 170 BST with a preference weapon, and that means pulling colorless with a demoted Velouria would be really healthy for the game because every color would provide you with an F2P option for arena scoring, along with the fact that she's an amazing unit for AR because she's colorless, doesn't necessarily have any outstanding weaknesses right now. Her res stat is unfortunately lower than I would have desired, but a res boon will help a lot. Air's Light Blessings patch that up to really make her shine in a way. So, but her stat spread's amazing, and I'm pleasantly surprised with Velouria, hoping she gets a demote because it would be really healthy for the game as a result. Okay, so kind of a budget way to use Velouria if you happen to have like a one-off is just using kind of like her base kit, giving her a seal of close defense, using something like Ignis. It's going to get like a turn 1 Ignis because her speed tends to be high enough to double through it, but if you're uncertain of that, you could always use like Bonfire instead. So on top of that, of course, Sea Dual Infantry is not required for Velouria, and like I said, really high hopes for that. But this is kind of like a one-off budget way to use Velouria. Doesn't have any particular weakness to a color, and as a result of that, is really nice. I'm okay. I think as a one-off, like Velouria can do a good job. But the ideal way that I highly recommend considering using Velouria would be something like that in its prime. And this is ideal if it's a demote. And I know it's a lot of ifs, but she is one of the best units to consider for this sort of role because she has so many things going for her. So, of course, you have your cooldown special reduction on her weapon. You got infantry benefiting from stuff like infantry pulse if you wanted. You could set up ethers. You can combine her with Caden because they're both beasts and whatnot. Racing for 3 movement dancers. There's a lot of really good potential. She can benefit from ward beasts, goad beasts, and I think this is the biggest difference between her as an infantry unit and somebody like, let's say, Fur or Donald that are very comparable null C disrupt units. So because she can benefit from like ward beasts, you could make a team with like Kaden, Racing, Nasala, for instance, or Panne, and give them all like ward beasts, and that ends up being far more stat stacking than it would be with Donald, who would have to rely on stuff like drive defenses or fur or whatever, drive reses and such. So that is the pinnacle of support and a super tank in something like AR for those fire sweep teams or the healers that may give you trouble. So yeah, I mean, this is what I want to do, but it highly depends on whether the availability becomes a thing. I think most people don't realize the potential of Velouria, but being colorless, no weakness, and being able to just make everything a mathematical stat comparison makes her the prime unit for AR because you can literally just plant her into the enemy phase range and almost nothing could kill her. The biggest weakness is the res, and that's why you would be using something like air to patch that up or extensive support. Big thumbs up from me for this unit. Really good potential. consider Soul, of course. I didn't mention it, but Soul as a 1 charge, the first unit that hits you, gets 1 shot, and you heal like half your health most likely. So, again, really cool things. She can also benefit from, and I hate to say this, but Infantry Rush. So for even more consistency with Soul, you could have somebody running that skill, for instance. So there's a lot of things you can do here. I'm not a big fan of Infantry Rush, but for long-term sustain, you could also consider things like that. So moving on, enough about Velouria. We have probably the most talked of unit, I would say, which would be Kaden. So Kaden is amazing as well. Not only is he in a movement weapon role type that is not that common, which is green cavalry, 3 movement physical damage. Like I mentioned yesterday, Walhard, Groom, Marth, Titania, Gunter, and like Frederick are pretty much like the most common green axes, but there's not that many of them, and you likely don't really have any of these built or similar stat spread to somebody like Caden. Of course, he's also a beast, so there's all those things going for him. But what does make him amazing is the fact that he's a really good support unit. So if you have like a tactics, which by the way, Seth, Weapon Refined video, Seth, guys, like Seth giving 4 to all stats, or at least 6 to 3 stats if you run them with triple tactics or Titania as well, but that's a little conflict in movement type. Seth, Kaden, you have your 2 cavalry units, you have maybe a super tank like Viloria, like mentioned earlier, and you have yourself big stat stacks that way. And Kaden pretty much has that Erica weapon, so he's providing it to somebody else. He could be within 2 spaces, ally supported, and he could be buffing up to like 7 to 8 stats as a result of that. So Kaden is amazing in that regard. However, we do already have this boy, which is Corrin. So if you already have a Corrin, which I would assume most people do because he's really good for making super units, you don't necessarily need to go all out for Kaden because it's similar. Now, the thing with Kaden, and I have to make this clear, is Kaden is tricky to use because, 1, he's a beast, so using his like effects isn't as convenient, and he also relies on those buffs hitting not only the unit itself that you want to buff up, but him as well. So positioning can become a problem, especially if you encounter stuff like cavalry, like trenches, I'm saying, or forests, or rivers and whatnot. So positioning isn't as easy as it would be to use Corrin, who just needs to be 2 spaces within range of whoever he's supporting. So that little bit of a difference there can definitely matter. You might end up in situations where you can't really position Kaden, the buffer, and your tank all within 3 spaces of each other, and that's the trickiest part of using Kaden. So again, Corrin, a little bit easier to use, and that's why you still got to consider using him. Of course, Kaden's potential is a little bit higher. Ally support, weapon, tactics, and you're good to go. But don't forget Corrin. As you can see from the build sample on the left, stuff like Fury could help him soak some chills. Drive res is what I use, so he can be within 2 spaces. You can use drive speed. It doesn't really matter. Whatever support you have, switch those out. You could also use double spurs as well, but I'm a little hesitant to use those because sometimes you can't place them right beside. So besides that, in the whole support dilemma, we have ourselves a comparison on how you would actually use Kaden besides just supporting, and this is ideally the way that you would think about it. So Kaden would have to run something like Heavy Blade, A-Slot, Quick Impulse to compare to like Groom Marth running Slaying Axe, Gale Force, and Heavy Blade in the Seal. You would need some sort of buff, Hone Cavalry, Hone Beast for instance, to do this sort of thing, and you need to find the right target. So it's not super consistent, but this is how you ideally want to use these types of 3 movement units, especially in AR. Pick off some units, kill them, Gale Force, try to like trap units. This is mostly how the gameplay comes down to. If you're not tanking things, you got to player phase aggressively, and Kaden can work with that. Now, there is something, of course, that makes Caden a little bit interesting, and that's if he's already ally supported with Velouria, and you have Caden ally supported with Velouria, that means his Gale Force would go down to 3 charge, which makes him far more consistent in this regard. You don't have to really give him Heavy Blade and A, you could use it in the Seal slot instead, or use even like Quick Impulse, potentially, depending if the unit he attacks into hits him back and whatnot, and therefore you don't run into these kind of checks when it comes to stats and whatnot. So yeah, similar kind of idea here. Caden, pretty much the green, fast, decent bulk kind of unit here, and that's how you would use him if you want to use him besides just supporting. Definitely between Caden and Velouria, I'm pleasantly surprised by their potential, and for one-off units, they're still pretty good. Velouria, if you don't end up using her like as a tank, just as a one-off to reduce the special cooldown charge of something here like Grumarth, for instance, is still really good, because then you have a 2-charge Gale Force, and if you end up killing a unit in one hit, you know, that ends up being really good. So next up is Selkie. So a lot of people probably saw the big old Yu-Gi-Oh text here and thought that Selkie was like gonna be ridiculous. I think the same factor, the same Flora effect. You read Flora's weapon, you thought she's really amazing. But the thing is, Flora didn't end up being that great. And I'm going to actually say that I'm not too impressed with Selkie either. I think Selkie could be really good on an AR defense team, where if properly danced by, like, let's say Legendary Azura, and it becomes some sort of snowball effect, and she has that 30 impact kind of effect, minus attack on her weapon, all these kind of shenanigans end up making Selkie very oppressive to fight against, but not necessarily using her. So just like how I've mentioned with Caden and Gale Force kind of situations, that's how I envision Selkie's best use as a player unit, is pretty much comparable to somebody like Perry, because Perry has a good stat spread, very comparable to Selkie actually. Don't forget that you can speed refine something like Slaying Lance. Perry has 33 base attack, and you know that goes a long way for these exact same things. The high res is comparable to end turn. Selkie does have more res, so she's a little bit better in that regard, but Selkie unfortunately has much less bulk, and she's relying on her weapon to make up that discrepancy. So if you run into really high stat units, and unfortunately Selkie doesn't have the BST benefit that somebody like Keaton or Velouria did, you end up not really winning in a lot of cases because of really high stat units, like armors, for instance. If she were to attack into those, it could be very inconsistent in that regard. But yeah, Heavy Blade, Quick Impulse, ways to use Selkie, these are kind of what I envision as well. You got to use like Gale Force. If you don't use Quick Impulse, you could always use the Seal instead. A slot could be just like Fury and you're good to go in the same way, but you'd rely on the enemy hitting you. 29 attack may look like, why would you use Heavy Blade with that? But you got to consider her weapon effect itself, which gives her like up to 8 attack, and of course debuffing the enemy's attack by 4 makes Heavy Blade decently consistent on Selkie, and therefore pretty good in that regard. If you don't use her aggressively as a Gale Force unit, then of course there's a dude that actually has more res than Selkie. Yeah, and you can actually support a bit better than Selkie. So if you end up using Selkie as like your 3 movement support unit, well, there's actually a better unit in the same movement type that can do it. And that's our old man here, who has much less stats, but in the places that matter if you're going to create support, which is that incredible res stat. You can use the brand new support weapon Wagasa from NY Levitine to debuff defense. You can run the double ploys of speed and attack, or you can interchange them for, let's say, res ploy if you need that. And then yeah, you got yourself 46 res, pretty much ploying everything in the game at that point. So there's always something people forget, and you know, if you're gonna use Selkie that way, then old man over there can do it. Okay, finally, last up is Panne. So I think just like the Selkie thing, you probably look at Panne and you're like, oh, 29 attack, that looks pretty disappointing. She's again a bunny that can't enter a forest, but Panne is a little interesting because she ends up having a kind of misleading attack stat, especially when you consider those heavy blade effects. So she has a Fury solo skill without the drawback. She has 30 impact on her weapon, which doesn't let you retaliate, and she has that -4 attack on the enemy, which means that heavy blade checks end up being like 36 attack. Like she has like a deceptive 36 attack, which is pretty good when you consider like Hone Beast or Hone Cavalry to buff her up to hit that a bit better, or attack speed tactic depending on what you have. And yeah, so you can give her something like this, and as long as she has her buffs, she'll become pretty good at doing this as well. Especially when you consider, again, that you can have someone like Raisin beside her, and that's the biggest difference here. You could do the same thing with Selkie, by the way, I mentioned that, but the thing I want to mention is Raisin and Leanne, 3 movement dancers that can actually follow up with 3 movement units like Panne. This was what made Tibern really good, and what makes Naysala really good, is that you have these units that move, and then you have a dancer that can actually follow them consistently. And that's what makes Panne, Selkie, Naysala, Caden, of course, all these units really good, because 3 movement dancers are restricted to beast at the moment. There's no real cavalry dancer, and that's why considering this and something like AR is huge to up your consistency when handling these teams that just otherwise can't be enemy phased with your tanks. With all that being said and done, and by the way, Panne, good AR defense unit. If you really want to create some good teams, she can definitely pick off a lot of stuff, because 30 impact is so hard to deal with. You would need like QR, good speed, good attack, lowering attack and whatnot. I think has some potential on AR defense. But finally, if you're a big fan of the rabbits, how can I go a whole comparisons video without mentioning our boy? Yeah, there he is. The best chef himself, Oscar. So he's helping the wabbits as well with his carrot lance. And what can I say? It's Oscar. I don't have much to say. Don't copy that build, guys. Come on. I just had to throw Oscar in here somewhere. Just made sense. All right. So yeah, overall, I'll go through the mathematics so you guys get a better feel as to what you can expect out of this banner. So it is a 4-person banner. You got 1 of each color. That's not necessarily a good thing. If you're looking to pick up one of these units, especially with your free summon tickets and whatnot, I highly recommend green and colorless, because as one-offs, both Kaden and Velouria offer something to your team, but unfortunately Selkie and Keaton can be compared to units you may already have, and they don't really offer you too much, especially outside of a bonus season. They'll probably get benched long-term. Of course, unless you summon for them later. But if you are summoning for them later, you should be summoning for them later, because then they won't be on a 4-person banner. You could get value out of the legendary banners, where they share with units that you could get good fodder with, or adding merges to legendary mythic heroes if you're looking to climb ranks instead. They could come back later on 3-person banners, or even a 2-person banner, where you're getting much more value for your orbs. Somebody like Keaton, for instance, if you're 1 in 10 people, you could end up spending 400 orbs, and that's harsh, because in a monthly allowance of free-to-play orbs, you're only looking at about 300. So if you end up being that 1 in 10 person that has to spend that much for Keaton, it ends up hurting your long-term game plan as a result. Therefore, patience pays off. Use your free summon tickets for green colors. This is what I plan to do. And maybe we can hope for a demote on one of the 3 units with 4 skills here, which was Keaton, Kaden, and Velouria. My personal preference being Velouria, because I feel it would be healthy for the game to allow her to drop down. There's nothing really that crazy in terms of skills that she offers, and I just feel like having an option there for people who might be pulling colorless to not feel so bad, the fact that they can't increase their score in arena because there's nothing that's high BST there, for instance. So yeah, all that being said, please let me know what you think of these units in the comments below. If there's any particular builds that I may have missed, or you feel like you want to use these units in some crazy team comps, please let me know. Are you planning to save here? Are you interested in these units at all? I don't know. Feel free to let me know. As always, you can keep that discussion going. Give the video a thumbs up if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel if you're not. And I will see you guys, actually a video in a few days, maybe even tomorrow or the day after. I'll be releasing an AR defense and offense ultimate compilation of my best week in AR so far, which was rank 2 in the world. So look forward to that, and I'll cover exactly what I go through to beat that. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.